Imagine waking up on the one day of the year that is supposed to belong to you. Father's Day. The smell of pancakes in the kitchen. A homemade card waiting on the table. And instead, you open your front door to find two police officers standing there because your own son called them on you. That is exactly what happened to a man named David Miller. And the story you are about to hear is not just about betrayal. It is about a father who lost everything in a single morning and the quiet, patient plan he built to get his son back and expose the truth that no one wanted to believe. David was 42 years old, a construction supervisor, the kind of man who showed up early, stayed late, and never missed a single school event, even when his marriage was falling apart around him. He had one son, Ethan, 12 years old, the center of his entire world. On that Sunday morning, David had planned something simple. Pancakes, a movie, maybe a walk in the park. He had even bought Ethan a new bicycle, hidden in the garage, wrapped in an old blanket, so it would be a surprise. Instead, at 9 in the morning, there was a knock at the door. Not Ethan's laughter. Not a hug. Just two uniformed officers, and behind them, standing at the end of the driveway with his arms crossed, was Ethan himself, refusing to make eye contact with his own father. "Sir, we received a call about a domestic disturbance and a possible threat to a minor," one officer said. "We need to ask you a few questions." David's stomach dropped. His hands started shaking. A threat? To who? I don't understand. The officer looked at his notes. The call came from this residence. From your son. David turned to look at Ethan. The boy who used to run into his arms every single day after school. The boy who once said, "Dad, you're my hero." Now that same boy stood there, cold, distant, refusing to even look at him. "Ethan," David said quietly, his voice breaking. "What is going on? Why would you say something like that?" Ethan didn't answer. He just looked down at his phone, and for a split second, David saw something strange, a message notification lighting up the screen. A name he did not recognize. That single moment, that flicker of light on a screen, would later become the key to unlocking everything. But right now, in this moment, David Miller had no idea that his own family was about to be torn apart by a lie so carefully built, it would take him months to unravel it. Before we go further, ask yourself this. How well do you really know the people whispering into the ears of those you love? Because sometimes, the most dangerous voice in a child's life is not a stranger's. It is someone hiding in plain sight, smiling at family dinners, while quietly poisoning everything from the inside. Stay with me, because what David discovers in the next few weeks will completely change how you see this story. To understand how a father ends up standing outside his own home, being questioned by police on Father's Day, we need to go back 3 years. David and his ex-wife, Rachel, had been married for 11 years. It was not a perfect marriage, but it was a real one. They built a small business together, a home renovation company, and they built a life around their son, Ethan. David worked with his hands. Rachel handled the books and the client calls. For years, it worked. Then, slowly, things changed. Rachel started spending more time at networking events, meeting new people, expanding what she called her side of the business. One of those new contacts was a smooth-talking man named Victor Hale. Victor sold himself as a business consultant, someone who could help modernize the company and bring in bigger clients. David never liked him, not because of jealousy, but because something about Victor felt rehearsed, too polished, too eager to be in every conversation, every family dinner, every school pickup. Rachel and David's marriage ended not long after Victor entered the picture. David tried to fight for the marriage, but by the time he realized how deep Victor's influence had grown, it was already too late. The divorce was finalized. Rachel got primary custody of Ethan. David got weekends and every other holiday. But even after the divorce, David never stopped showing up. Every weekend, without fail. Every school play. Every soccer game. He never missed a single moment. Even when it meant driving 2 hours after a 12-hour shift just to watch his son's 5-minute performance in a school assembly. For the first year after the divorce, Ethan was still close to his dad. He still called him every night before bed. He still asked when he could stay longer during the weekends. But then Victor moved in with Rachel. And slowly, subtly, something in Ethan began to shift. He started canceling weekend visits. He said he was busy or tired. He stopped calling as often. And whenever David asked simple questions, "How was school? How's your mom?" Ethan's answers became short. guarded, almost rehearsed. David noticed it, but he told himself it was just a phase. Boys go through phases, he thought. He didn't want to believe that anyone would deliberately try to come between him and his son. He didn't want to believe that somewhere in that house, someone was quietly rewriting the story of who David really was. He had no idea that Victor had already started planting seeds. Small comments here, exaggerated stories there, turning a loving father into, in Ethan's eyes, someone to be afraid of. And on that Father's Day morning, those seeds would finally bloom into something devastating. 3 months before that fateful Father's Day, something had started to feel very wrong. Ethan began referring to Victor as Dad in front of his friends. He stopped wearing the watch David had given him for his birthday. He started asking Rachel if he really had to go to David's house on weekends. David tried talking to Rachel about it. "Something's changing with Ethan," he said over the phone one evening. "He seems distant, almost scared of me sometimes. Do you know why?" Rachel's response was cold. "Maybe he's just growing up, David. Not everything is a conspiracy." But it was more than growing up. It was something engineered. Victor had a pattern. He would casually mention things to Ethan like, "Your dad works so much, he probably doesn't have time to really care about you the way I do." Or, "Some men just aren't built to be real fathers. It's not your fault your dad couldn't keep the family together." Each comment was small, deniable, but repeated enough times, over months, it built a story in Ethan's young mind. A story where David was the villain, and Victor was the hero who had saved the family. Victor even started keeping a private note on his phone, tracking every small mistake David had ever made, being late once to a pickup because of traffic, raising his voice one time after a stressful day at work, forgetting a school form because of a scheduling mix-up. Normal, human mistakes. But Victor collected them like ammunition, waiting for the right moment to use them. That moment came 2 weeks before Father's Day. Victor sat Ethan down and told him a story, a version of events from years earlier, twisted and exaggerated, claiming that David had once lost control during an argument with Rachel, and that Ethan should be careful, because some men have a temper that never really goes away. It was a lie, a cruel, calculated lie. The argument Victor was referring to had happened years earlier, and it involved raised voices, nothing more. No violence, nothing that ever put Ethan in danger. But Victor twisted it into something terrifying, something designed to make a 12-year-old boy afraid of his own father. Victor even coached Ethan on what to say if he ever felt unsafe, including the exact words to use if he ever needed to call for help. He was planting a trigger, and on Father's Day, Victor pulled it. That morning, before David even arrived to pick up Ethan for their day together, Victor whispered one final comment. "Remember, Ethan, if your dad ever raises his voice, ever seems angry, you know what to do. You call for help immediately. It's for your own safety." Ethan, confused, scared, and manipulated by months of quiet poison, believed him. And when David simply asked him to hurry up so they wouldn't be late for their pancake breakfast, using a slightly firm tone because they truly were running late, Ethan panicked. He picked up his phone, and he made the call that would change everything. Standing in his own driveway, surrounded by flashing lights, David felt something break inside him that he would carry for a long time. The officers separated him from Ethan and asked him a series of questions. Had he ever raised his voice at his son? Had he ever grabbed him? Had he ever made him feel afraid? David answered honestly, every single time. "I have never touched my son in anger. I have never hurt him. I love him more than anything in this world." But the officers had to take the call seriously, as they should. Child safety always comes first, and David understood that, even through his own heartbreak. They spoke with Ethan privately. They asked him gentle questions. And here is the part that broke David the most. Ethan, confused and coached, gave answers that sounded rehearsed. He repeated phrases that were not his own words. Phrases like, "Sometimes he gets really intense," and "I just didn't feel safe." Phrases that sounded exactly like something an adult had carefully planted in his mind. After nearly 2 hours of questioning, the officers determined there was no evidence of abuse, no marks, no witnesses, nothing that legally justified any further action. They left with a simple note in their report. Unfounded claim, no charges filed. But the damage was already done. Word spreads fast in a small town. By that evening, some neighbors already knew the police were called to David's house. Some friends texted him awkward, careful messages, unsure of what had happened. His own mother called in tears, having heard a distorted version of the story from someone at church. Rachel, instead of calling David to understand what happened, sent a single text message. "I think it's best if Ethan takes a break from weekend visits for a while, until things calm down." David sat alone in his kitchen that night. The pancake batter he never got to use still sitting in a bowl on the counter, the wrapped bicycle still hidden in the garage. He stared at his phone, waiting for a message from Ethan that never came. For the first time in his life, David felt something he had never experienced before, being punished for a crime he never committed, judged by silence, and losing the one person who used to run into his arms every single day. He wanted to scream. He wanted to drive to Rachel's house and demand answers. But he knew that reacting with anger would only prove the lie that Victor had built. So instead, David did something much harder. He sat quietly, in the dark, and made a decision. He was not going to fight this with anger. He was going to fight this with truth. And he was going to find out exactly who had turned his own son against him, no matter how long it took. The weeks that followed were the hardest of David's life. He was allowed only supervised phone calls with Ethan, arranged through a family mediator, while the family court reviewed the case. Many men in David's position might have given up, might have let the anger and humiliation push them into isolation. But David chose a different path. He hired a family lawyer named Angela Cruz, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had handled dozens of cases involving parental alienation, a term David had never even heard before, but one that Angela explained to him in their very first meeting. "What you're describing," Angela said, "is a textbook pattern. A child slowly turned against one parent through repeated negative comments, exaggerated stories, and emotional manipulation, usually by someone new in the household. It's more common than people realize, and courts are starting to take it very seriously." For the first time since Father's Day, David felt a small flicker of hope. Angela advised him to do 3 things. First, keep a detailed journal of every interaction, every phone call, every visit, exactly as it happened, with dates and times. Second, request access to any documentation Ethan's school counselor might have, since children experiencing this kind of manipulation often show signs at school as well. Third, and most importantly, remain calm, consistent, and loving in every single interaction with Ethan, no matter how distant the boy seemed. David followed every piece of advice with quiet discipline. He showed up to every supervised call, every approved visit, always calm, always warm, never once mentioning Victor, never once trying to argue his case directly to Ethan. He simply kept being a steady, safe presence. Meanwhile, Angela began building the actual case. She discovered that the school counselor had, in fact, noted some concerning changes in Ethan's behavior over the past several months. Increased anxiety, difficulty sleeping, and comments in a journaling exercise that referenced fear of making the wrong person angry, language a counselor had flagged as unusual for a child his age. David also remembered something important, that flicker of light on Ethan's phone screen on Father's Day morning. He asked Angela if there was a legal way to review the messages, given the seriousness of the situation. Angela filed the appropriate request through the family court, given that a false emergency call was involved. What they eventually uncovered would confirm everything David had feared. The court-approved review of Ethan's phone records revealed a pattern that had been building for nearly 6 months. Message after message from Victor to Ethan, filled with carefully worded comments. "Your dad probably won't even notice if you skip this weekend. Some men just don't know how to be gentle. If you ever feel unsafe, you have every right to call for help, no matter what he says." There it was, the exact phrase, "call for help." The very words Ethan had used that Father's Day morning, sitting right there in a message sent by Victor 2 weeks earlier. Angela also uncovered something else, something David had never expected. Victor was not simply a controlling boyfriend trying to be the better father figure. He had a financial motive as well. Records showed that Victor had been quietly advising Rachel to shift more of the renovation company's ongoing contracts and client relationships toward a new business entity, one that Victor himself had partial ownership in. If Rachel and David's shared custody situation became more strained, and if David's reputation was damaged enough, Victor stood to gain significantly more control over the family business David had helped build from nothing. In other words, turning Ethan against his father was not just about jealousy or control. It was, in part, a calculated financial strategy, using a 12-year-old boy as a pawn. When David learned this, something in him hardened, but not into anger, into resolve. He did not want revenge in the way people often imagine revenge. No shouting matches, no public humiliation, no attempt to destroy Victor out of spite. David wanted something far more powerful. He wanted the truth to be laid out so clearly, so undeniably, that no one could ever twist his story again. Angela prepared everything for a formal family court hearing. Text message records, school counselor notes, a financial audit trail connecting Victor's advice to Rachel with his own business interests, and a professional child psychologist's evaluation of Ethan, conducted gently, over several sessions, without pressure or leading questions. The psychologist's final report used a term that would become the turning point of the entire case: parental alienation, consistent with coach testimony, resulting from third-party manipulation. David finally had, in black and white, undeniable proof of exactly what had happened to his family. But proof on paper was not the only thing that mattered. Angela reminded David of something important during one of their late-night calls preparing for the hearing. Judges don't just look at documents, she said. They look at patterns of behavior. They want to see who has been steady and who has been reactive. Every single supervised visit you've shown up to, calm and consistent, is part of your case too. So David kept showing up. Even on the days it hurt the most, the days Ethan barely spoke to him, the days the mediator's small office felt colder than any courtroom, David sat across from his son and simply talked about ordinary things. School, cartoons, the neighbor's dog. He never once brought up Victor. He never once asked Ethan to choose a side. He simply remained the same steady father he had always been, patiently waiting for the fog to clear. Slowly, almost invisibly at first, small cracks began to show in the story Victor had built. Ethan mentioned, almost in passing, that he missed their old Saturday morning bike rides. Another week, he asked if David still had the old telescope they used to look at stars with. These were not just memories. They were signs that somewhere underneath the coaching and the fear, the real relationship between father and son had never actually disappeared. It had only been buried. There was one more piece of the puzzle that Angela insisted on tracking down before the hearing: the renovation company's client contracts from the past year. David, still a part owner of the business on paper even after the divorce, had every legal right to request a full review of recent decisions. What the accountant found confirmed Angela's suspicions completely. 3 of the company's largest long-term clients had been quietly redirected toward Victor's new venture over the previous 8 months. Each transition explained to Rachel as smart restructuring and modernizing the brand. In reality, it was the slow, deliberate transfer of everything David had spent a decade building. When David first saw those numbers, his hands trembled, not from fear this time, but from a kind of clarity he had never felt before. This was never just about a father and a son drifting apart. It was about a man who had calculated, piece by piece, exactly how much he could gain if David simply disappeared from the picture, as a father and as a business partner. The court date was set, and for the first time in months, David allowed himself to imagine a different Father's Day, one where the truth, not a lie, would finally be heard. The family court hearing was quiet, formal, nothing like the dramatic courtroom scenes from movies. But for David, it felt like the most important moment of his entire life. Angela presented the evidence methodically: the messages, the financial documents, the counselor's notes, the psychologist's evaluation. Piece by piece, the true story of the past year unfolded in front of the judge. Rachel sat through most of it in visible shock. It became clear, through her own testimony, that she had not fully realized the extent of Victor's manipulation either. She admitted, through tears, that she had been so focused on her own emotions after the divorce that she had not paid close enough attention to what Victor was quietly doing to her son's relationship with his father. Victor, when questioned directly about the messages, tried to downplay them as just trying to help Ethan feel more comfortable expressing his feelings. But when confronted with the financial records connecting his advice to Rachel with his own business interests, his composed exterior began to crack. His answers became defensive, inconsistent, evasive. The judge, after reviewing everything, did not hesitate. The court found clear evidence of manipulative behavior that had caused significant emotional harm to a minor child and ordered immediate changes, full reinstatement of David's custody rights, mandatory family therapy for Ethan, and a formal restriction preventing Victor from being involved in any decisions regarding Ethan's care or well-being going forward. There was a long silence in the room after the ruling was read. David did not smile. He did not feel triumphant. He felt, more than anything, an overwhelming wave of relief, the kind that comes after carrying a weight for so long you forget what it feels like to stand without it. Across the room, Rachel wiped her eyes, her earlier shock giving way to something closer to grief. Grief for the year her son had lost, and grief for how blind she had allowed herself to become. Victor left the courtroom that day without saying a word to anyone. Within a few months, word around town was that his business had collapsed under the weight of the very scrutiny the court case had brought on, as former clients quietly reviewed their own contracts once the full story became known. But the moment that meant the most to David happened outside the courtroom, not inside it. Ethan, now finally away from Victor's constant influence, and after several honest sessions with the family therapist, began to remember things clearly again. He remembered the truth of his childhood, the Saturday morning bike rides, the bedtime stories, the countless nights his father stayed up late finishing his own work just so he could make it to Ethan's school events the next day. One afternoon, several weeks after the hearing, Ethan asked his mother if he could see his dad. Not a supervised visit, just to talk. David arrived at the agreed meeting place, his heart pounding, unsure of what to expect. Ethan stood there, quiet, his eyes filled with something David hadn't seen in over a year. Not fear, not distance, but recognition. "Dad," Ethan said softly, his voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I didn't understand what was happening. I believed things that weren't true." David knelt down, pulling his son into his arms, and for the first time since that terrible Father's Day, he let himself cry. "You don't have to apologize," David whispered. "You were a kid caught in the middle of something you never should have had to carry. I'm just so glad to have you back." In the months that followed, David and Ethan slowly rebuilt what had been broken. It did not happen overnight. Trust, once shaken, takes time to fully heal. But every weekend, every phone call, every small moment of honesty between them added another brick to that foundation. Rachel, to her credit, worked hard to repair her own relationship with David as co-parents, acknowledging openly how much she had missed while distracted by her own pain after the divorce. Victor eventually moved away, his reputation in their small community deeply damaged once the truth of his manipulation became known. The following year, on Father's Day, David woke up to a very different morning. Instead of police officers at his door, he found Ethan standing there with a card he had made himself, and behind him, propped against the porch, the very bicycle David had hidden in his garage the year before, the one Ethan had discovered weeks earlier and asked to finally ride together. They spent the entire day together, laughing, riding through the park, eating pancakes at their favorite diner, exactly as David had planned all along, just 1 year later than intended. So what is the lesson in this story? It is easy to believe that love alone is enough to protect a family. But love without vigilance can be quietly poisoned by those who know exactly which words to whisper and exactly which seeds to plant. Manipulation rarely announces itself loudly. It creeps in slowly, disguised as concern, disguised as care, until the people we love the most begin to see us through a lens built entirely out of lies. David's story teaches us something powerful, that the truest form of strength is not reacting with anger when we are wronged, but standing firm in patience, gathering the truth, and trusting that honesty, given enough time and care, will always find its way back to the surface. If there is someone in your life who has been quietly, subtly pulled away from you by someone else's carefully placed words, do not give up on them. Stay consistent. Stay calm. Stay honest. Because sometimes, the people we love simply need time and undeniable truth to find their way back home. And if you are the one who has been coached, misled, or manipulated into believing something false about someone who has only ever loved you, it is never too late to ask questions, to seek the truth for yourself, and to give real love the second chance it deserves. This has been the story of David and Ethan Miller, a father who never gave up, a son who found his way back, and a Father's Day, 1 year later, that finally became everything it was always meant to be. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the truth may take time, but it always finds its way home.